The neural harvester hummed, its frequency vibrating through the clinic's floorboards. Julian Vance watched the progress bar on the primary terminal. He didn't look at Evelyn, whose consciousness was currently being filtered for proprietary algorithms. He looked at the real-time valuation of the Project Phoenix data stream. Sync rate is lagging at 78%. Julian said, tapping his signet ring against the glass monitor. The merger goes live in 2 hours. Sarah needs the stabilization codes to sustain her public profile for the global broadcast. Fix your synchronization, Evelyn. Every second of delay costs the board $10 million. You are becoming an expensive liability. Evelyn lay on the tilted chair. Her neural pathways felt like they were being flushed with liquid nitrogen. Her skin was the color of bleached bone. For 3,650 days, Julian had used her as a biological server. He didn't marry a woman. He acquired a living data vault. He didn't offer a home. He offered a series of cold system links and cognitive locks. My neural core is hemorrhaging. Julian, Evelyn whispered. Her voice was a dry, digitized rattle. Julian disconnected the link with a sharp, careless jerk. He didn't check for system feedback. A spark of static discharge hit the floor. He ignored it. He wiped a speck of dust from his sleeve and checked a notification on his phone. It was his lead counsel, Marcus. The assets are ready for transfer, Julian muttered. He slid a black tablet onto Evelyn's chest. The screen blinked. Property surrender total and unconditional. The marriage is a legal fiction, Julian spoke to his reflection. The Vane patents now belong to the Vitalis board. You are a depleted asset, Evelyn. Sarah found a fresh source. A younger, faster neural host in Singapore. You are redundant. I've already authorized the deletion of your records. You leave tonight. No name. No alimony. No history. Evelyn looked at the flickering LED overhead. The Singapore source is a trap, Julian. You are overwriting your soul with a virus. I am scaling my empire, Julian sneered. He grabbed her thumb. He pressed it hard against the biometric scanner. Access granted. Assets transferred. He turned off the cooling units, turned off the lights, and walked out. He left her rebooting in the cold dark. 2 hours later, the grand hall of the Pierre Hotel. The air smelled of ozone and arrogance. Julian Vance stood center stage. Sarah Miller stood beside him, her face glowing with the stolen stabilization codes. She looked like an armored god in her liquid metal dress. Tonight, we launch the future, Julian shouted to the elite of the medical world. Vitalis owns the code. Vitalis owns the life. We have officially archived the legacy assets. Then, the emergency alarms screamed. The heavy steel doors didn't open, they buckled. They were kicked inward by a force that bent the reinforced metal like wet cardboard. Silas Vane entered. He didn't wear a tuxedo, he wore black tactical gear under a long coat. He smelled of rain, cold iron, and absolute power. He moved like an apex predator entering a cage of lab rats. Silas walked straight to the stage. He didn't use the stairs. He jumped. The stage cracked under his combat boots. The silence was a physical weight. Silas ignored Julian. He ignored the cameras. He looked at Evelyn, who stood in the back row, wrapped in a stolen lab coat, her eyes burning with a cold new fire. Evelyn, Silas called. His voice was a low-frequency vibration that made the champagne glasses rattle. Evelyn walked forward. The crowd scrambled to clear a path. Silas reached out. He didn't offer a hand. He grabbed Evelyn by the waist and hauled her onto the high-top glass podium. He stood between her legs, his hands gripping her thighs with crushing force. Julian Vance, Silas said. His eyes were dead pits of black ice. You have been consuming Vane data for a decade. Mr. Vane, the contract is signed, Julian stammered. He tapped his phone to call his lawyer. Marcus, get in here. Sue this man for trespassing. Marcus, the lead counsel of Vitalis, stepped out of the shadows. But he didn't stand next to Julian. He stood behind Silas. The lawyer? Julian gasped. Not your lawyer, John Doe, Marcus said, holding up a digital folder. I've been the Vane family's liquidator for 20 years. You didn't pay me to represent you, Julian. You paid me to catalog your crimes until the Vane heir was ready to collect. Marcus tapped the screen. As of 60 seconds ago, all your offshore accounts have been reclassified as stolen Vane assets. I am no longer your counsel. I am your primary creditor. and I'm calling in the debt. Julian Vance lunged for the security terminal embedded in the podium. His fingers flew across the haptic glass, eyes manic. He wasn't looking for a guard, he was looking for the vein erasure protocol he'd hidden in the core. If he couldn't have the data, he would burn the server. Authorization Vance Alpha 0. Execute purge, Julian screamed. The terminal didn't turn red, it didn't flash. A localized electrostatic discharge. A system shock surged from the glass directly into Julian's fingertips. The high-frequency pulse didn't burn his skin. It fried the neural links Julian had spent a decade refining. Julian's arm went dead. He slumped against the glass, his breath a ragged whistle. Status unknown entity. The system's voice boomed through the grand hall. Security breach detected. Neutralizing noise. Noise? Julian gasped, staring at the screen. I am the architect. I am the one who built the grid. You were the parasite, Silas said. He sat on the edge of the glass podium, one hand resting heavily on Evelyn's hip, the other tapping a rhythm on his tactical belt. He watched Julian with the detached interest of a scientist observing a dying cell. Evelyn is the architect. You were just the user who forgot to pay the subscription. The security guards moved in. These weren't the men Julian had hired. They were the vein extraction team. They didn't use handcuffs, they used digital dampeners. They grabbed Julian by the collar and hauled him off the stage. Sarah Miller tried to retreat into the shadows of the marble pillars. She clutched the silver threads of her dress, but the aesthetic sync was failing. Without the neural stabilizing codes Julian had stolen from Evelyn, Sarah's synthetic enhancements began to desync. Her jawline sagged. Her skin, once glowing with artificial radiance, turned a dull, sickly gray. The face of Vitalis was dissolving into a mosaic of digital glitches and biological exhaustion. Wait, I have a contract? Sarah shrieked as two janitors approached her. These weren't just any janitors, it was Mrs. Gable, the woman Sarah had fired and blacklisted last month because her cleaning solution smelled too common. Mrs. Gable stopped. She leaned on her industrial vacuum, looking at the woman in the gray, sagging skin. She didn't look angry. She looked at Sarah like she was a stain that needed a specific chemical to remove. Sarah Miller? Mrs. Gable asked. Don't look at me, you peasant. Sarah tried to cover her face. I'm not a peasant. Dear, Mrs. Gable said, reaching for a high-pressure sanitizing hose. I'm the one who cleans up the waste products. And according to the new management, your aesthetic profile has been flagged as environmental litter. Mrs. Gable squeezed the trigger. A blast of cold, pressurized cleaning fluid hit Sarah squarely in the chest. It didn't hurt her, but it stripped away the expensive liquid metal sheen of her dress, leaving her shivering in a thin, wet slip. You look like a glitch in the system, Sarah, Mrs. Gable noted, her voice flat. Maybe a night in the loading dock will help you recalibrate. On the stage, Silas pulled Evelyn closer, his chin resting on her shoulder. He watched as Julian was dragged toward the service exit. Julian tried to scream, but the system shock had paralyzed his vocal cords. He was making the sound of a dying modem, a series of high-pitched digital screeches. Sterling, Silas murmured, is the identity wipe complete? Just as Sterling looked at his tablet, Julian Vance's social security number has been reallocated to a shelter in the Bronx. His fingerprints now linked to an unsolved vagrancy case from 1998. Digitally speaking, Julian Vance is a ghost. This man on the floor, he's just an unauthorized biological presence trespassing on Vane's soil. Excellent, Silas said. He turned his attention back to Evelyn. He didn't offer a romantic gesture. He took her hand and inspected the scars from the neural links. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his signet ring against her knuckles, leaving a deep, territorial mark. Julian, Evelyn spoke, her voice amplified by the room's speakers. You always said I was just a component in your machine. I've decided to upgrade. I'm deleting the obsolete hardware. Julian clawed at the floor, his fingernails breaking against the marble. He looked at the guests, the billionaires and scientists he had dined with for years. They didn't look at him. They were already downloading the new Vein Biosystems app. They were already looking for the next winner. The guards didn't walk Julian out. They threw him. He hit the wet asphalt of the service alley, landing face first in a puddle of stagnant oil. The heavy steel doors slammed shut. Thud. Julian scrambled to the biometric pad on the wall. He pressed his thumb against the glass. He prayed for the green light. He prayed for the system to recognize its God. The screen blinked. Error, data not found. Please dispose of refuse. Julian Vance crawled toward the curb. He wasn't reaching for a hand, he was reaching for his phone. His fingers, numb from the system shock, fumbled with the titanium casing. This was his ghost device, an encrypted satellite uplink tied to an offshore vault in the Caymans. It was his final insurance policy, $50 million in untraceable digital currency. He managed to trigger the facial recognition. The screen pulsed violet. Unknown biometric profile. No, 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 Julian whispered. He tried the iris scanner. He pried his eye open with shaking fingers. The screen flickered, then displayed a live feed of a burning server room. A text overlay scrolled across the screen, Vane Family Trust. Reclamation complete. The phone vibrated once, then turned into a dead brick of glass and metal. Julian threw it against the brick wall. It didn't shatter, it just thudded into the mud, as useless as the man who held it. Julian, is that us? Sarah Miller's voice was a cracked reed. She was huddled near a stack of industrial waste bins. Without the neural stabilization, her face of the future had become a mask of exhaustion. Her synthetic implants were misfiring, causing her left eye to twitch in a rhythmic mechanical loop. She looked like a low-budget android discarded after a failed experiment. Julian didn't look at her. He looked at the shadows moving at the end of the alley. A group of night shift dock workers approached. At their head was Leo, a man Julian had used as a test subject for an early unstable version of the Phoenix Protocol. Leo's skin was scarred with the same gray bloom that was now spreading across Julian's chest. "Mr. Vance," Leo said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded like a man looking at a broken piece of equipment. "Leo, thank God." Julian scrambled toward him, his knees scraping the wet asphalt. "I have a backup server in the city. Get me there. I'll give you the keys to the lab. I'll fix your skin. I'll make you a king." Leo looked at the biometric tablet in his hand, the standard issue for all Vane-owned logistics staff. He pointed the scanner at Julian. Result: UN authorized noise. Status: disposable. Leo didn't offer a hand. He pulled a high-pressure industrial hose from the side of the loading dock. "The architect said the alley was cluttered," Leo said, his voice a low, grating rumble. "She said the trash was starting to smell." "I am the architect," Julian screamed, his voice breaking into a digital screech. Leo squeezed the trigger. A blast of ice-cold deionized water hit Julian in the face. It wasn't meant to kill him, it was meant to displace him. Julian was swept off his feet, tumbling into the gutter alongside the discarded crates and rotten food. Sarah tried to scream, but Leo turned the hose on her next. The pressure stripped the last of her vanity away, washing the expensive synthetic beauty into the sewer. At the end of the alley, the black Rolls-Royce Ghost idled. The engine didn't purr, it hummed with the sound of a supercomputer. The tinted window slid down exactly 2 inches. Silas Vane was visible in the dim interior light. He didn't look at the carnage in the alley, he was looking at a holographic display floating above the center console. It showed Julian's social security data being shredded into random code fragments. Silas reached over and grabbed Evelyn's hand. He didn't hold it gently, he locked his fingers through hers, pressing her hand against his thigh in a hard territorial grip. He leaned in and pressed his face into the curve of her neck, his breath hot against her skin. "The drive is clean, Evelyn," Silas murmured, his eyes fixed on the man in the gutter. "There's no trace of the virus left in the system." Evelyn leaned back into him, her fingers tracing the Vane crest on his tactical vest. She felt the vibration of the car's engine through his chest. She looked at Julian, the man who had called her asset and won for a decade. "Finalize the format," Evelyn said. Silas tapped a command on the holographic screen. In the alley, Julian felt a sharp static pop in the back of his skull. It was the cognitive anchor, the digital link that tied his memory to the global network. Suddenly, he realized he couldn't remember the address of his childhood home. He couldn't remember the names of his parents. The system hadn't just deleted his money, it had overwritten the digital records of his human history. To the world's servers, Julian Vance had never been born. I am... Julian opened his mouth, but the name was gone. It was just a void in his mind where a person used to be. The Rolls-Royce began to move. It didn't swerve to avoid Julian. The massive, reinforced tires rolled within inches of his head, splashing a wave of oily, stagnant water into his open mouth. Julian choked on the taste of failure and grease. Sarah Miller lay in the mud, her eyes glazed. She looked at a group of street sweepers approaching. These were people she used to call bio-waste when she passed them in her limousine. One of the sweepers stopped. She looked at Sarah's melting features. "Need a lift, honey?" the sweeper asked. "Yes, help me." Sarah sobbed. The sweeper pointed to the back of the garbage truck, the heavy-duty compactor designed for industrial scrap. "Hop in, that's where the expired hardware goes. We're taking it all to the incinerator tonight." The sweeper didn't wait for an answer. She activated the hydraulic arm, the mechanical claw reached down, scooping up a pile of wet cardboard and Sarah's silver slip in one jagged motion. Julian watched the red taillights of the Rolls-Royce disappear into the rain. He tried to call out to the car, to the woman he had farmed, to the god he thought he was. But the speakers in the alley only played a smooth, corporate loop of elevator music. The format was 9. Julian Vance staggered toward the primary gates of the headquarters. He didn't look up at the sign, he didn't need to. The red neon burned his retinas with a new name. Evelyn Biosystems. The letters didn't flicker, they were steady, clinical, and permanent. The name Julian Vance had been overwritten in the physical world just as it had been in the digital one. The gate was a biometric fortress Julian had designed to keep the unworthy out. He pressed his entire face against the cold glass of the scanner, gasping for air that felt like lead in his collapsing lungs. "Julian Vance, access level 0. Emergency voice override, reset the grid." Julian screamed. The scanner pulsed white, a neutral, blinding light. A voice, calm and synthetic, echoed from the hidden speakers. It was Evelyn's voice. The system-wide interface he had forced her to record during the early years of the Phoenix Protocol. "Entity not found," the system said. "Security breach detected, liquidating unauthorized biological presence." The gate didn't open. Instead, a localized sonic frequency, a data purge, hit Julian's chest. The neural links in his system, the stolen algorithms that had kept his heart beating in sync with the grid, began to desync. He coughed, a dark synthetic fluid spraying onto the pristine glass. It wasn't blood, it was the failure of his synthetic stability. The system was literally rejecting his right to breathe. "Julian?" A voice croaked from the dark corner of the loading dock. It was Sarah. She was crawling on her hands and knees. The street sweepers had finished their work, and the industrial sanitizers had stripped her of the last of her vanity. She was bald, her scalp a patchwork of gray shadows where the synthetic implants had short-circuited and died. She wore a discarded plastic tarp she'd found in a bin. She wasn't a socialite, she wasn't a woman. She was a pile of expired hardware. "Help, me." Sarah reached for Julian's ankle. Julian looked at her. He didn't see the partner who had helped him betray Evelyn. He saw a mirror of his own obsolescence. He kicked her, using the last of his failing strength to strike her in the face. "Stay away from me, you rotting glitch," Julian yelled, though his voice was now just a series of digital pops. Sarah collapsed into the mud. She didn't cry. The system had reclaimed her ability to produce moisture. She just lay there, her eyes fixed on the bright lights of the lobby she used to rule. A black Rolls-Royce Ghost glided to a stop at the curb. The door opened with a silent, heavy click. Silas Vane stepped out. He held a black umbrella, but he didn't use it for himself. He reached back into the car and pulled Evelyn out. Ellen was wearing a coat made of black obsidian silk. She looked like the end of a century. She looked like the beginning of a war. Silas wrapped his arm around her waist. He didn't just hold her, he anchored her. He pressed his thumb against the pulse point on her neck right over the mark he had claimed. He was monitoring his primary asset. "Ellen!" Julian crawled toward her, his fingers scraping the wet asphalt. "Tell the system, tell them who I am. I gave you a name. I gave you the platform you're standing on." Evelyn stopped. She looked down at the man in the mud. She didn't see a husband. She didn't see a human. She saw a corrupted file that needed to be purged from the server. "You didn't build a platform, Julian," Evelyn said. Her voice was as cold as the rain. "You took a loan on my future, and the interest has finally bankrupted you." Silas chuckled, a low vibration in the wet air. He looked at Julian with the detached interest of a god watching an insect. "He's still producing noise, Sterling," just as Sterling stepped out of the shadows. He held a tablet. The audit is closed, Mr. Vane. Julian Vance is officially recorded as deceased due to system failure in the National Registry. The man on the ground is a John Doe trespassing on Vane's soil. Handle the waste, Silas ordered. Silas turned Evelyn toward the building. He moved her with a possessive, crushing force. He leaned down and whispered into her ear, his eyes tracking Julian's final, pathetic spasms. The Queen is home, Silas murmured. They walked toward the gate. The scanner didn't pulse white. It glowed a deep, respectful gold. Welcome home, Architect Evelyn, the system spoke. The gates swung open. Evelyn and Silas walked through the threshold. The lights of the lobby blazed to life, illuminating the path for the new rulers of the city. Behind them, the sanitation truck returned. The hydraulic arm reached out. It didn't discriminate between the trash bags and the entities in the mud. Julian Vance tried to scream one last time. He tried to claim his name, but his vocal cords had short-circuited. The system had overridden his conscious mind with a final command, terminate session. Julian's hand fell limp. The rain washed the last of the gray fluid into the gutter. Inside the Rolls-Royce, which was now driving away toward the Vane estate, Silas pulled Evelyn onto his lap. He locked his arms around her like a cage. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of victory and sandalwood. The audit is closed, Silas murmured against her skin. And the expansion? Evelyn asked. Silas smiled. It was the smile of a predator that had just consumed its world. He took her hand and pressed his signet ring against her finger, leaving a mark that would never fade. The expansion begins tonight, Silas said. We own the world's pulse now, Evelyn, and I own the heart that generates it. The car disappeared into the dark. In the alley, the sanitation truck moved on. The asphalt was clean. The name Julian Vance was no longer a word. It was a silence. The execution was absolute.
Watching Julian try to log into a life that no longer recognizes him is the most satisfying digital execution I've ever witnessed. If you had the power to overwrite someone's entire existence with a single click, would you actually pull the trigger? Or is that a line you'd never cross? I actually spent way too much time researching real-world system wipes for this script just to make sure Julian's social death felt as cold and mechanical as a hard drive format.